For 93 years, a concrete wall on the Carmel River in central California held back a reservoir that had, quietly and almost invisibly, stopped being a reservoir at all. It had turned into something else entirely, something almost nobody downstream fully understood until engineers started digging into exactly what was hiding behind that wall. And when California finally decided to take the dam apart, they didn't do it the way anyone expected. They didn't blow a hole in it and let the river do the rest. What actually happened was stranger, slower, and far more dangerous than a simple demolition, and the river's response afterward left the scientists monitoring it, struggling to explain what they were looking at. The dam in question was San Clemente Dam, built in 1921 in a steep, narrow gorge in the Santa Lucia Mountains, meant to secure drinking water for the growing Monterey Peninsula. At the time, it was considered a genuine feat of engineering, a 106-foot concrete arch wedged into a canyon barely wide enough to hold it. For decades, it did exactly what it was built to do. Then something the original engineers never fully accounted for started happening behind the wall, slowly, year after year, completely out of sight. Sediment. The Carmel River, like every river on Earth, carries a constant load of sand, silt, and gravel downstream. Under normal conditions, that material moves all the way to the coast, replenishing beaches and building the natural shape of the watershed. But a dam stops that movement cold. Every grain of sediment that would have continued downstream instead settled at the bottom of the reservoir year after year, decade after decade, with nowhere else to go. By the time engineers took a hard look at San Clemente Dam in the early 2000s, they found something that should have alarmed anyone paying attention decades earlier. The reservoir behind the dam, the pool of water it was originally built to store, had almost entirely disappeared. Not because of drought, because of dirt. An estimated 2.5 million cubic yards of sediment had accumulated behind the dam, filling roughly 90% of its original storage capacity. San Clemente Dam wasn't holding back a lake anymore. It was holding back a hill, and that hill created a problem far more serious than a reservoir slowly losing its usefulness. Engineers determined that in a major earthquake, a real possibility given the dam's location near active fault lines or in a significant flood event, the aging structure could fail catastrophically, sending that entire buildup of trapped sediment crashing downstream all at once. A wall of mud and debris moving toward homes and infrastructure along the lower Carmel River with almost no warning. The dam built to protect the region's water supply had quietly become one of the most serious dam safety risks in the state of California. So state regulators made a decision that surprised almost everyone watching the project from a distance. Removing the dam wasn't optional forever. It was a matter of time before nature forced the issue anyway, and the only real question was whether California would take it apart on its own terms or wait for an earthquake to do it first, on nobody's terms at all. Here's where the plan should have been simple. Tear down the dam. Let the pent-up sediment flow downstream. Let the river reclaim its natural path. But 2.5 million cubic yards of trapped sediment, released all at once, would have been catastrophic in its own right, choking the river with mud, wiping out fish habitat for miles, and burying everything downstream under a flood of displaced material nobody could control once it started moving. You cannot simply detonate a 100-foot dam holding back that much buried sediment and hope for the best. If you get this wrong, you don't restore a river. You destroy it a second time, all at once, in a single afternoon. So engineers designed something almost nobody outside the project had ever attempted at this scale. Instead of removing the sediment, they decided to reroute the river around it entirely. Crews carved an entirely new channel through solid rock alongside the old reservoir, engineering a path that would let the Carmel River bypass the trapped sediment altogether rather than tearing straight through it. They built this new channel gradually, carefully, connecting it to the river's original path at points designed to control exactly how and when the water would start interacting with the old sediment deposit. It was less like demolishing a dam and more like performing surgery on an entire canyon. moving a river without letting it touch the 2.5 million cubic yards of material sitting directly in its former path. Even the engineers who designed it weren't fully confident going in. A new channel carved through rock is not the same as a river's natural bed, shaped by thousands of years of water finding its own path of least resistance. There was a real quiet fear on the project that the moment the river hit that engineered channel at full force, it might not behave the way the models predicted. Erosion could undercut the new banks faster than expected. The connection points between old riverbed and new channel could fail under pressure nobody had fully tested at this scale. Every dam removal before this one had involved letting a river return to a path it already knew. This was the first time anyone had asked a river to trust a path it had never seen. And they did almost all of it away from public view. There was no dramatic demolition footage of a wall exploding into a canyon on command. No single moment for cameras to capture. Just years of quiet, incremental engineering happening deep in a gorge most people driving past on the nearby highway had no idea was even underway. The dam had been part of the landscape for over 90 years. Its removal happened so gradually, so far from any road, that plenty of long-time residents of the Monterey Peninsula didn't fully register it was gone until long after the work had finished in 2015. Once the new channel was complete and the river began flowing through its rerouted path, engineers held their breath for something else entirely. Whether the sediment, now bypassed rather than blasted, would stay put, or whether erosion along the edges of the old reservoir would slowly destabilize the whole structure anyway. It didn't. The rerouted channel held, and that's when the actual recovery started, faster and more dramatically than almost anyone monitoring the project expected. Before removal, this stretch of the Carmel River had been essentially inaccessible to one of California's most endangered native fish, the South Central California coast steelhead trout. The dam had blocked their migration route to upstream spawning grounds for nearly a century, cutting off access to roughly 25 miles of prime habitat in the upper watershed. Within the first full season after the river reconnected, biologists documented steelhead moving upstream past the former dam site into stretches of the Carmel River they hadn't been able to reach since before the Roaring Twenties. Not years later. The same season, water quality data followed a similarly fast trajectory. Researchers tracking sediment transport downstream found that the river began naturally redistributing material along its bed within months, rebuilding the kind of gravel beds steelhead need to spawn successfully. Beds that had been essentially frozen in place behind the dam for generations. The riparian vegetation along the newly exposed banks of the old reservoir area, land that had been submerged or buried under sediment for the better part of a century, started re-establishing itself almost immediately. Willows and cottonwoods taking root in soil that hadn't seen open air in living memory. None of the scientists monitoring this project had a strong prediction for how fast any of this would happen. Dam removal projects of this scale, especially ones involving a full river reroute rather than a straightforward demolition, simply didn't have much precedent to draw from. The working assumption going in was caution. Watch closely, expect a slow, uncertain recovery. Be prepared for complications nobody could fully anticipate. What they got instead was a river that, once physically reconnected to its own historic path, essentially picked up where it had left off 93 years earlier. At a small gathering marking the completion of the project, engineers and conservationists who'd spent years planning the removal walked the new channel together, watching water move through a stretch of canyon that had been buried under concrete and silt since before any of them were born. One long-time local fisheries biologist, who had spent decades documenting the decline of Carmel River steelhead, described standing at the edge of the new channel and watching the current move through gravel that hadn't felt flowing water in generations. She'd spent most of her career writing reports about a fish population that only ever seemed to shrink, one survey at a time, and had genuinely stopped expecting to see a turnaround like this in her working lifetime. Watching juvenile steelhead hold in the current of a channel that hadn't existed a few years earlier, she said, was the closest thing to watching a river get its memory back. But this story doesn't end on a purely triumphant note. And that's worth sitting with honestly. The engineered channel bypassing the old sediment deposit isn't a permanent maintenance-free fix. It requires ongoing monitoring to make sure erosion doesn't eventually threaten its stability. And the 2.5 million cubic yards of old sediment sitting just outside the river's new path haven't gone anywhere. They're stabilized, monitored, and for now staying put. But for now is doing real work in that sentence, and the agencies responsible for the site know it. Removing a dam safely doesn't always mean removing every risk that built up behind it. Sometimes it means finding the least dangerous way to live alongside what's left. Still, for a project most people never saw happen, carried out quietly in a canyon most people never visit, the result speaks for itself. A river that had been effectively broken for 93 years reconnected to itself and started healing on a timeline that surprised the very people who'd spent years preparing for something much slower. If you want to see how this engineered channel holds up over the next decade and whether the fish keep returning at this pace, subscribe, because California is quietly running more experiments like this one, and most of them never make the news either.